The Watts family case remains one of the most horrifying true crime stories in modern American history. Not just because of the brutality of the murders themselves, but because of the man who committed them. Chris Watts didn't look like a killer. He looked like the guy next door. He smiled for family photos. He coached his daughter's soccer team. He posted loving messages to his pregnant wife on Facebook. When Shannon Watts and their two daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, vanished on the morning of August 13, 2018, Chris Watts stood before television cameras with a pained expression and pleaded for their safe return. He described the disappearance as earth-shattering. He begged the public for help. He looked exactly like a grieving husband and father should look. But here's what makes this case so deeply disturbing. That performance was constructed. It was calculated. And as we now know, by the time Chris Watts made those pleas, his wife and daughters were already dead. Their bodies disposed of at the remote oil site where he worked. Today, we're going inside the mind of a family killer. Not just to recount what happened, because you likely know the broad strokes of this case, but to understand how a man could methodically plan the murder of his own family, maintain his composure under police questioning, and ultimately reveal the chilling psychological truth about who he really was. This isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about emotional extinction, narcissistic entitlement, and the terrifying gap between appearance and reality. To understand the Watts case, you have to understand the timeline, not just of the murders themselves, but of the psychological deterioration that preceded them. By most accounts, Chris and Shannon Watts appear to have a normal, if financially strained, marriage. They declared bankruptcy in 2015, like so many families do. They had their ups and downs. But friends described Chris as a devoted father. Quiet, perhaps, but loving. On the night of August 12, 2018, Shannon Watts was returning from a business trip to Arizona. She was 15 weeks pregnant with the couple's third child, a son they planned to name Nico. Her friend Nicole Atkinson picked her up from the airport and drove her home, arriving at approximately 1:48 a.m. on August 13th. That was the last time anyone outside the Watts family would see Shannon alive. What happened in those early morning hours remains seared into true crime history. Chris Watts would later claim that he and Shannon had an emotional conversation about divorce, that she'd threatened to take the children away, that he'd told her he no longer loved her. But whatever words were exchanged, we know what actions followed. By 5:15 a.m., when Chris Watts left for work, Shannon was dead. Bella and Celeste would die shortly after, during the 45-minute drive to the oil site where Chris worked. But here's the detail that investigators found most telling. Chris Watts didn't just kill his family in a moment of rage. He drove for more than 40 minutes with his daughters still alive in the back seat, their mother's body on the floor of the truck. At the oil site, he buried Shannon in a shallow grave. Then, and this is almost unbearable to say, he suffocated his daughters one by one. 4-year-old Bella fought back. She bit her tongue during the struggle. Her final words, according to Chris Watts' later confession, were, "Daddy, no." When police first interviewed Chris Watts, they encountered a man who appeared appropriately concerned, but something felt off. Body language experts who later analyzed his television appeal identified 4 distinct gestures that betrayed his guilt: a fleeting look of pleasure when talking about wanting his family back, a hand shrug that signaled lack of confidence in his own words, eye closures that suggested internal conflict, and a slight head shake that contradicted his verbal message. But it wasn't body language alone that cracked the case. On August 15th, Chris Watts agreed to take a polygraph test, likely believing he could beat it. He couldn't. When confronted with the results and with evidence of his affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger, Watts' carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Psychologist and former psychiatric nurse Jesson James has analyzed the Watts case extensively. He points to what he calls the disconnect between identity and reality, the hallmark of someone who has compartmentalized their life so completely that they can commit unspeakable acts while maintaining a normal appearance. James notes, "It's not always the monsters we see coming that are the most dangerous. It's the ones who blend in, who smile at the neighbors, who post family photos like everything's perfect, while something else entirely is going on beneath the surface. This brings us to the central psychological question of the Watts case. What kind of person does this? Clinical analysis suggests that Chris Watts displayed classic traits of narcissistic personality disorder combined with psychopathic features: lack of empathy, grandiose thinking, a sense of entitlement to a new life, regardless of the cost, and perhaps most significantly, what psychologist James calls emotional extinction, the complete shutdown of emotional connection to those who were once loved. In his own words from prison, Chris Watts revealed something chilling about his mindset before the murders. He said, "It just felt like there was already something in my mind that was implanted that I was going to do it, and when I woke up that morning it was going to happen and I had no control over it." Psychologists dismiss this as an attempt to avoid responsibility, to portray himself as a passenger in his own body rather than the driver. As James puts it, it was calculated, premeditated. How does a man go from family man to murderer? The answer is, slowly, over time, through layers of suppressed emotion, buried resentment, unfulfilled needs, and an inability to face the consequences of his actions. Watts didn't just want out of his marriage. He wanted out of his identity. The husband, the father, the responsible provider. He painted himself into a corner of duty and routine, and he saw only one way out. His affair with Nicole Kessinger represented the fantasy life he craved, a life free from financial stress, from family obligations, from the mundane realities of raising young children. When Shannon returned from her business trip, she wasn't just a wife returning home. In Chris Watts' mind, she was an obstacle to his fantasy. This is the difference between a crime of passion and a crime of extinction. Passion murders happen in the heat of the moment, a fight that escalates, a sudden surge of rage. But Chris Watts didn't kill in passion. He killed because he had emotionally divorced his family long before he physically ended their lives. In his mind, they were already obstacles, already problems to be solved. And that psychological detachment allowed him to do things that most human beings cannot fathom. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder. The plea deal removed the possibility of the death penalty, a decision Shannon's family supported, not out of mercy for Chris, but because they refused to perpetuate more loss. They'd already lost a daughter, 2 granddaughters, and an unborn grandson. They didn't want to lose years to appeals and legal battles. But here's where the story takes another disturbing turn. After his sentencing, Chris Watts was transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. And there, in his cell, he reportedly hung photographs of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste. He told investigators that he talks to them every morning and every night. Public reaction was immediate and furious. A petition demanding the removal of these photos gathered thousands of signatures. How could a man who murdered his family display their images like trophies? But psychologists offer a more complex interpretation. For Chris Watts, those photographs may not represent love or remembrance. They may represent possession, control, the fantasy that his family still belongs to him. This isn't remorse. It's an extension of the same narcissistic entitlement that led him to kill. So what do we take from the Chris Watts case? Not morbid curiosity, though the case certainly draws that. Not simple condemnation, though condemnation is absolutely warranted. What we take is understanding. Understanding that appearances can be dangerously deceptive. Understanding that emotional detachment is sometimes more dangerous than overt rage. Understanding that when someone stops seeing their family as people and starts seeing them as obstacles, the capacity for violence expands terrifyingly. Shannon Watts was a mother, a daughter, a friend. Bella and Celeste were little girls who loved their daddy and trusted him to keep them safe. Nico never had a chance to draw his first breath. Their lives mattered, not just as victims in a true crime story, but as human beings whose futures were stolen by a man who chose his own fantasy over their reality. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. He'll never harm anyone again. But the questions his case raises, about deception, about entitlement, about the masks people wear, those questions remain. And if we're willing to ask them honestly, we might just spot the warning signs before another family becomes a statistic. If this case touched you, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We don't just tell these stories for shock value, we tell them to understand, to remember, and to prevent. Thanks for watching. Stay aware and stay safe.